Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is Jane's Garden in a Jane Austen mug, so I guess we're doing something Jane Austen related. Jane's Garden, by the way, is a Harney and Son green tea with jasmine and other floral notes and floral bits. And I really do like the tea. But this is, yeah, so I'm wrapping up Jane Austen July. I already did one sort of wrap up earlier, so I'm not actually going to talk about much about the books that I talked about already, because that seems to be a little redundant. But I will just talk about what I read, I guess, in the later part of July. I read four books. So in later July, two of which were actually Jane Austen related, and the other two were not. So onward. So the first one was a nonfiction, which is one of the prompts to read something about like Jane Austen's time, her biography of her, something like that. So this time around, there were a couple of books that I haven't finished and I might finish. They're about the Regency, but it got a little wrapped up into all the royal mistresses, stuff like that, and I got a little bored. So this was slightly different. This was Jane and Dorothy by Marion Weavers. Yes. It says, A True Tale of Sense and Sensibility, The Lives of Jane Austen and Dorothy Wordsworth. So this is, it's a dual biography, kind of mainly making out Jane Austen to be like Eleanor from Sense and Sensibility, and Marianne Dashwood would be Dorothy Wordsworth. And although they sometimes do things that are slightly different, like for instance, Jane Austen wasn't super romantic. She had, romantic encounters, as it were, like someone she was very interested in when she was younger. That's a story that's been told many times before. But she also had proposals that might have been very good for her family, for herself. But she didn't love those people, so she turned them down. So I think that is a little not as sense as it is sensibility, and how she, in the long run, did not let almost anything get in the way of her writing, how important the writing was to her life, even though she was, a woman of her time and did her duty most of the time and was a good daughter in so many ways, although she didn't really seem to get along with her mother. She never seems to, so I think that must have been true in some way. But also that she was, some of it you say, okay, she had no choice. You know what I mean? She seems like the good, sister, good aunt, to her nieces and nephews. But most of the time she had no choice. If someone needed her, well, she wasn't married. She had no one else to answer to. So she had to go where she was sent to. Her older sister did a lot of that too, but sometimes Jane would be needed to help out somewhere. And if she were in a place and wanted to go elsewhere, she'd have to wait for one of her brothers to escort her. So sometimes I don't think it was just her being dutiful, although she wasn't super rebellious either. Sometimes it was just that she had no choice. And yet she was able to have herself somewhat of a satisfying writing life. And in the end, even though she didn't live as long as Dorothy Wordsworth did, she may have had the better, in the long run, situation. I think that's what this book sort of brought out. Whereas Dorothy Wordsworth was a bit more romantic, and she grew up, both her parents died when she was pretty young. So she was brought up in different aunts and uncles' families and grandparents and everything. So she went from place to place. And then finally, they call it eloping, which is a little weird, but she ran away with her brother, William, to live with him and support him and set up house for him, which isn't necessarily a terrible thing for, a spinster aunt kind of situation, but it feels like she gave up her own interests, whatever she would have had. Like, she kept a journal and stuff, and she did a bit of writing, but it seems like everything she did was to support her brother. And we don't know her heart, we don't know her mind, obviously, in the long run we don't, but it does seem like that a lot, that she kind of sacrificed herself to be everything to her brother, And when her brother got married, she was still living with them. And I think in this sense, she seems to have gotten along better with her sister-in-law than Jane Austen got along with most of her sisters-in-law, or at least two of them, I should say, because Jane Austen had one sister-in-law that was a sister of one of her really close friends, but who ended up just being kind of obnoxious to Jane and Cassandra, etc. And then she had another sister-in-law, Elizabeth, I think, who married her brother Edward, who was the rich one, because he was sort of adopted by another wealthy couple. Truck is going by, who didn't, have any heirs, so he benefited in that way. And his wife she and Jane Austen seem to have had some sort of friction, and that seems to, I keep saying seems to because we don't know everything, but it seems to have been proven by the fact that after Jane's father died, there was a while there where they were a little bit itinerant, she and her sister Cassandra and her mother. They seemed to be living here and there, wherever they could afford to live, and, having to live off the little bit of help they got from each of the brothers, which must have been difficult, and we know that during that time, Jane's creativity was a little bit on the wane, and finally, Elizabeth, the wife, dies. Pretty sure her name was Elizabeth. I hate saying finally, but at some point she died, and after childbirth she had a lot of kids, and shortly after that, Edward offers a cottage on his estate in Chawton to his mother and daughter and sisters. Unless it just became available at the time, which doesn't seem to indicate that it just became available, why wouldn't he have done that sooner? So in that way, Jane might have had a little bit of issues with some of her family, and that seems to be brought out by some of her writings. Fanny Dashwood, for instance. Oh my goodness, right? the way she treats the other Dashwood sisters, but I don't know if that's the only reason that was written. But even there's a quote from Mary Wollstonecraft that brings out how sometimes the single spinster sisters of a brother who has a wife, the wife doesn't usually get along with them, or can make things difficult for them too, because she's the one who had the influence, and it wouldn't be fair for the husband to give everything maybe to his siblings, but maybe a little something, especially if you're very well off like Edward. I don't know. So that was kind of interesting, and yeah, it goes into both of their lives, and also Dorothy's relationships with other well-known writers like Coleridge and De Quincey, who I really want to read more of, actually, just because I have some of his stuff and haven't yet. A little bit of touching on opium addictions and stuff. But, and obviously William Wordsworth himself features in here. But the thing that weirded me out, and I know I need to read more about William Wordsworth himself, maybe to see what other writers would have said about this, but she really kind of makes the brother and sister out to be incestuous, which, at the very least, to be very physically affectionate with each other, and at least mentally incestuous. And I'm like, well, we don't know exactly. Some of the writings may seem to be like that a little bit, of Dorothy's and the letters and everything, but I never like when things lean too much toward that, just like I didn't like last year when I read The Banker Sister, which was mainly about Jane Austen's brother Henry, and the writer seemed to imply that Jane had a bit of a thing for her brother Henry. I mean, that's barely even mentioned in this book. Like, her relationship with Henry is barely even mentioned in this book, so I'm like, I think that's stretching, but again, I don't know enough about the Wordsworth siblings, even with this book. I would say, if you like to read about Jane Austen at all, and of this time period, I would say this is a good book. Just, if you know, that little bit is a bit weird. But I'm glad I read it. And I also read The Watsons by by Jane Austen. I can't believe I actually looked to check who wrote it, because I know who wrote it. This is one of the first books I bought with my first paycheck ever. My first paycheck at an actual job. There was a bookshop downstairs from where I worked, and it's not there anymore, but it was there a few years back. But anyway, actually it may not have been. There was that bookshop and a Barnes & Noble. I can't remember which one it was. You don't need to know this. But anyway, when I got that I got a few things with my paycheck, but I got this book, and I got the book that's up here, the Juvenilia. Oh, you don't need to see my upper arms. The Juvenilia of Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte, which I always thought was a weird combination. But be that as it may, that's what it was, and it has been a helpful thing to look into, actually. Because it has like love and friendship and stuff like that. But the Watsons is, Lady Susan actually was completed, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I read that last year. It was as complete as can be. I just want to make sure the notes that there's nothing about that. Yeah, it finishes. I knew that, but I just had to check, because I always doubt myself. Sanditon needed to be finished, and the Watsons was barely begun. And you can get the idea of what it's going to be about. The main Watson is Emma, and I bet the name would have been changed if Jane Austen would have returned to it, but she was, like Jane's brother Edward, she was an expectation of her aunt and uncle leaving her everything when they were gone. And so she actually lived with them and grew up with them. And then she ended up being disappointed in that way, sent back to her family, who barely knew her, with very little prospects. Her father was dying. And it opens up on her older sister, I think it's her older sister, telling her the story of what's going on in everybody's life. It's a lot of exposition. I think that Jane Austen would have edited it eventually. But yeah, it's a bit bleak, but she ends up going to a ball, dancing with a bunch of people. You know, you do see hints of what's to come, and there might have been a very promising romantic relationship. But we don't know really what was going to happen. So if you are a completist and you really just want to read everything Jane Austen wrote, and especially a book that was written already when Jane Austen had already written Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Northanger Abbey, I'm pretty sure all of them had already been written and somewhat edited by the time The Watsons was written. So you're not reading her earlier, more satirical, like silly work as I think of it. This actually had the seeds of what was going to be possibly a really good Jane Austen novel, but she just abandoned it, maybe because her father died. Maybe that was just too much for her, I don't know. But it wasn't like an amazing read because it did feel very in need of polishing and work. But we'll never know. And it does have an older brother, a brother, married to a woman, and they're doing pretty well. And the sister-in-law seems to not take much of a liking to Emma. So we see a bit of Jane Austen in there too. Possibly, at least according to Jane and Dorothy. I don't know. I feel like I need to just keep reading more Jane Austen biographies and see if these all agree. I have read a number of them, but, forget things over the years. So that was it for Jane Austen July. Fantastic. I enjoyed it very much. Even the books I didn't like as much, I still enjoyed. And I'm looking forward to next year. But let's not rush things. These are the 2 books that I finished that were not actually Jane Austen books. And this is where, I cannot say the name, Mary Westmacott, who was Agatha Christie. She wrote under this pen name because she didn't want to write straight up detective novels. This is The Burden, which I read for Kate House Summer of Suspense and had a really fun discussion with a bunch of people on Zoom. And it's called A Superb Novel of Possessive Love. It's so strange. It's such a strange novel. It's about 2 sisters. What are their names again? Laura and Shirley. Laura is very overprotective, absolutely loves her younger sister. Basically, Dorothy Wordsworth style, maybe, gives up everything for her sister. And and her sister ends up meeting some guy, and the story goes on from there. And you think it's going to go a certain way, and then something happens, something very 1950s, and, at least in my opinion, and then suddenly it turns over to another person's point of view who wasn't introduced, showing up at some island, and you're like, where is this going? And as time goes on, you do make the connections, and it's so bizarre. But I kind of think it was worth the read, even though it wasn't my favorite work that Agatha Christie ever wrote, for sure. But just because it's such a weird, twisty story. Someone mentioned Daphne du Maurier as a similar writing style. I'm not exactly sure if I agree with that per se, but I understand the vibe. So, yeah, I don't know what to say without giving it away, because I feel like you need to read this to go for the roller coaster ride. But if it sounds like something that you're willing to take on, it's not a long book. And if you are a completist when it comes to Agatha Christie and you need to read all of her things, not just her mysteries, yeah. Speaking of mysteries, this was a fantastic book in my opinion. This is The Bombay Prince, A Mystery of 1920s India by Sujata Massey. This is the third book in the, I don't know what they call it, the Perveen mystery novels, I guess. Her last name is Mistry, Mistry, which is a Parsi name. Parsis are a group of people who ancestrally, is that the expression, came from like Iran, Persian background, and moved to India for the most part, and settled there for centuries. And they had, different religion to like Hindus and Muslims, different customs, particularly funeral customs. And what's more important for this book is that they seem to have had like a pretty cooperative relationship with the British Empire, which I guess was beneficial for them in a lot of ways. They had a lot of successful businesses, etc. But in this story, the Bombay Prince, the Prince Edward, who was the Prince of Wales at the time, who would become Edward VIII, who abdicated for the woman he loved, supposedly, and all kinds of stuff. If you watch The Crown, he makes an appearance. Not very favorable toward him, but interesting. Yeah, he was one of the more interesting presences in that story, to be honest. But not in this book so much. He's just showing up to tour India, and there are a number of people who do not quite like there's a lot of people who are unhappy with the British Empire and the British having all this influence on everybody and would like their freedom. And Praveen, actually, she is a female lawyer, which is rare at that time. She works with her father, who respects her in a lot of ways very much, which is good. So they work pretty well together. But she's also interested like in Gandhi and everything, but things take a turn in this situation in which there's a bit of, not just a little bit of protesting, but there's a bit of violence and destruction, and a lot of it toward Parsis. And so it's a little scary for her and her family during this time. But in the meantime, she gets a visit from somebody who goes to the school that one of her very best friends, who is English, teaches at. And this woman, whatever, asks her a little bit of advice, and then a couple days later, she is dead. And it kind of looks like a suicide, but not really. And so Praveen obviously wants to get into the bottom of this, but there's a lot of things in the way. She has a bit of danger along the way too, in the middle of these kind of riotous situations. But she does get involved with the parents and also a lot of the customs that are involved with a funeral and getting the body, even though it's needed for investigation. There are, things to be considered, but dealing with the parents, dealing with the Parsi colonies, as they call them, trying not to step on anybody's toes, but doing so anyway. Meeting, having another meetup with someone she knew in a previous book, which seems to be the possible romantic relationship of the series. We'll see. I thought it was actually fantastic. It's really hard to explain without giving away so much of the plot. But there are so many different people from so many different walks of life. There's an American who shows up, a journalist. There's all the stuff that goes on at a school, especially for, a school that is co-ed in this time period in India, in what was Bombay, but now is Mumbai, in India. And I know this is probably not important to the plot, but there's a lot of descriptions of different foods and stuff that made me hungry. Like, there was a time where she and someone else, Praveen Mystery, is eating kulfi, which is a kind of like an ice cream. And I haven't had kulfi in so long. It has a slightly different consistency. I don't know how to describe it. Almost chewy, but in a good way. Different flavors. I know they had a mango one that I used to get, and another one with cardamom and everything. And they used to sell around the corner from me. They used to sell them, and they don't anymore. And now I'm like, I really need to get a hold of some coffee. And there's also a lot of descriptions of tea, chai mostly, but Darjeeling tea and teacups and everything. And there was one description of making chai that just, for me, that was fantastic. I know other people will be like, what? But I sort of figured out who done it, but not exactly why and how. And that's what I like. It gave me enough of why would people do this and what was really going on behind the scenes to really keep me interested, and it was enough history to keep me interested. So I love the combination of learning a bit of history, so like historical fiction, and dealing with the mystery. So it is a little, in some people's, I think, points of view, it might be a little slow going, the actual investigating of everything, but that's the whole point. This isn't someone who's just, oh look, a body, we got to figure out who did it, and we're just going to keep visiting people and doing that. There's like a whole process of working as an attorney. I think, what do they call it? A solicitor. She's not really supposed to talk in court, although there is a scene where she does. It's kind of interesting too. But yeah, so there's a lot of just getting around, and she has a bit of privilege. She has, they have a driver, they have servants and everything, but that's not incredibly uncommon in like the middle class, I think, in India, so of that time. So it's not implausible or anything, but she still has to deal with a lot of constraints of both different religions and gender, etc. So I thought it was brilliant, and I've liked all of the books so far, but I think this might have been my favorite. I don't know. Maybe it's just because it's the most recent one. Yeah, so that was the last part of Jane Austen July. I'm going to miss it a little bit. Although we are getting closer to autumn, although it's going to get hot again. I am looking forward to autumn, but I'm also kind of just wanting to enjoy the ride. So let me know how your Jane Austen July went. I've been watching some of the wrap-ups already, and it seems like a lot of good reading has been done. And let me know what you thought of these books, if you've read any of them yourself, if you have slightly different opinions. Who knows? So this is Catherine taking tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day.